As we continue our study of the Psalms, today we come to I think it's a particularly sensitive psalm. Probably one of the most strongest psalms in terms of where it takes place in the story of David's life. You may know that most of the psalms are written by David. Some people think all the psalms have been written by David, but probably only about 50%, just over 70 psalms were from David's own hand. And a lot of those psalms were written in times of deep distress and confusion. And so what you get, and I'll probably say this many different times in different ways as we go through the psalms, you get a very raw, very kind of to the point picture really of just what life is and was then, and I think betrays the same now. People like Korah and Asaph and scribes were the ones who kind of made up the other 48% of the psalms that we read. But on this particular psalm, I'm going to read you Psalm 3. It's a special psalm only in the sense that it captures David at possibly one of the worst moments in his life. And so what you have is unraveled is something of the heart of David, something of that kind of difficulty that he found within himself. I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version. If you have a Bible, then feel free to read along with me. So Psalm 3 reads like this. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Rise up, O Lord. Deliver me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people. What you discover in this psalm is 4 stages represented by 4 sets of couplets, if you like, 2 verses in each one, each captured by a single word. And so as we go through this psalm together, you'll find that that first word is the word wait, which we discover and will discover in verses 1 and 2. As you move then to verses 3 and 4, you get this wonderful word hope. And each of these words reflect deeply what David is going through, what he's trying to express, and perhaps what he's seeking God for. Wait, hope, and then as you get to verse 5 and 6, comfort, and then ultimately at the end of the psalm, verses 7 and 8, this wonderful word confidence, which rings through again and again with David. One of the characteristics of David's psalms is wherever he starts, he doesn't finish there. What do I mean by that? He can start in deep depression. He can start in despair. He can start almost sounding hopeless and in times almost blasphemous. But where he ends up is a place of great confidence, because something underneath the turmoil tells him that he knows that he knows that he knows God is a refuge, God is a sustainer, and God will bring deliverance. Whatever situation he's in, and that is really the bedrock of what we often reflect on as the Christian's great hope, great strength. It isn't that we go through less hassles than anyone else. It isn't that we go through less problems or that we're somehow shielded from the worst of life. I think you only have to have a cursory glance through history and you discover that Christians have suffered the most horrendous ordeals. But it's that within those dark, brutal, terrible places, hope and comfort and confidence can reign, which is remarkable. And I think we're going to discover that a bit as we go through this psalm. So let me take the first word, wait. David opens his psalm almost in despair. How many are my foes? Many are rising against me. We've all been here. How many times has this got to happen? How often have I got to go through this? How many people are kind of contrary to what I want to do and are beating on me and afflicting me? Now, the reason why, as I said before, this psalm is a particularly difficult one for David is that he is unpacking perhaps one of the most difficult points in his entire life, because it relates to his family and specifically to his son Absalom, whom he had a great deal of affection and devotion to. This story, this consternation that David is feeling, is a direct result of a confrontation that comes between him and his son Absalom. And it was a confrontation that was 7 years in the making, which is quite remarkable. 7 years ago, his son Absalom, his daughter Tamar, and the eldest brother Amnon fell into a very difficult pack of abhorrent behaviour. Amnon, the oldest one, took a shine to Tamar. The story is quite gross as you read through it in the book of Samuel. And he asks her to come to him and he wants to sleep with her. After a great deal of persuading, and it ended up Amnon's friend did most of the instrumental work bringing them together. Once he'd had her, Amnon then had this equally violent, equally strong aversion to her as he had a love for her, which is the oddest of things. And so he abandons her, having almost raped her technically, and then he leaves her. And of course, the first thing Tamar does is return to her brother Absalom. And at that time, 7 years prior to this psalm, Absalom more or less tells his sister, don't make a noise, just keep this to yourself. But what she doesn't know is deep inside his heart, Absalom is making a pledge that one day he will avenge his sister. 2 years go by when Absalom is brewing over this scheme, if you like. He's carrying this bitterness. And he approaches his father to put a feast together in which he wants all the family to come and be part of. And David can't get there. He excuses himself. But specifically, Absalom asks that Amnon be present. David is totally innocent as to the true motives of this and says, fantastic, go ahead. Be great to have all the family together. At that celebration, Absalom has already pre-warned a couple of his heavies that once Amnon gets there, they'll draw him apart, they'll finish the job. And that is exactly what happens. He's knifed to death and murdered at the celebration. 2 years of waiting, and Absalom wreaks his revenge on his brother for what he did to Tamar. News of this reaches David. And of course, by this point, Absalom is terrified for the fact that there will be repercussions on his actions. So he ups and leaves, as we read in scripture. He goes to a place called Geshur. That's probably about 180 kilometers from where David was in Jerusalem. And he stays there for 3 years in hiding, really, in seclusion. Well, in given our difficult situations at the moment with the coronavirus, we all know what it means to live in isolation. There was Absalom living in isolation for 3 years. At the latter end of those 3 years, Joab, who was the commander-in-chief of David's army, basically said, this is ridiculous. You can't carry on like this. Your son is living in exile. You need to bring him back. Took a lot of persuading, but eventually David said, fine, I'll give the go-ahead. You can bring Absalom back. So Absalom returns to Jerusalem. But while he's in Jerusalem, David ensures that he's housed somewhere separate to him. And for a further 2 years, David has no contact, not a word, not a postcard, not a letter, not a phone call, if you want to put it that way. No contact at all. That's another 2 years, which makes it 7 years in total since hearing of Tamar's rape. During those years, while he was in Jerusalem, those 2 years, Absalom plotted another plan. And his plan was to try and garner favour from David's people with the obvious intention that he was going to usurp his father. Somewhere in the making, it went from running to Geshur terrified to thinking, what am I running for? I can actually take this. I could overcome my father. 7 years after the rape of Tamar, David is running up a hill, fleeing for his life, while Absalom is sat in his castle, in his palace, taking his wives, drinking his wine, eating his food, basically replacing his father. 7 long years of bitterness in the making. And now we come to Psalm 3. Psalm 3 is David's reflections on what has just happened. And when he's looking at this, he's realizing it isn't just Absalom. A lot of the people he trusted, because they felt they'd be safer with the new king coming in, betrayed David and kind of did a double take and turned their back on him and went on to Absalom's side. And so it's no wonder David opens this psalm by saying, how many are my foes? Because now he's realized that it isn't just the enemies of his own household, but actually it's the enemies of his own palace, his own friends who've turned against him. And at moments like that, you can feel as if the world is against you. And there's that awful place. Now, of course, this shouldn't technically have been a surprise to David, because if you remember, you go right back to Samuel. And if you remember in 2 Samuel chapter 12, when David committed adultery with Bathsheba and then complicated and compounded that by having her husband murdered, Nathan is the prophet who comes to David basically saying to him, you know, God has seen this and God has clocked this and he knows you've done wrong. And part of the judgment at that point on David's life wasn't that God was now going to kill him. In fact, quite the opposite. Nathan said, you won't lose your life through this. But he has an interesting phrase in verse 11 of 2 Samuel 12, and it says this, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. David should have known that from within his own home, problems were going to come as a result of what he did. Many years later, those chickens came home to roost. And of course, Absalom is a product of that prophecy. So there's this incredible weight demonstrated. And one of the things you find is this. There is a proverb in verse 22 of Proverbs 17 that says this, a downcast spirit dries up the bones. Think about that. Think about that. What a fantastically descriptive way of defining what depression does. It dries you up. The energy is gone. The zest is gone. The enthusiasm is gone. The joy is gone. The peace is gone. You dry up. It's like looking at a land that was once plentiful with water and greenery and everything that's we count as healthy and vibrant, just turning into cracked sand, you know, dried up earth. That's what depression, downcast, does to people, Proverbs says. And then there's another proverb which again has often made me think. In Proverbs 14:10 it says, the heart knows its own bitterness and no stranger shares its joy. The Hebrew word knows is much more of a tactile word. It means to feel, to sense, to understand, to absorb. The heart absorbs its own bitterness. Nobody quite understands that. There is a point, there is a depth that each of us sink to, at which nobody, and perhaps not even the closest person to us, which could be a sibling or a parent, could well be a spouse, even they don't quite understand how we're feeling. And part of that is perhaps because we can't articulate what we're feeling. David, in 8 verses, is trying to articulate something that is deeply ingrained as a heaviness in him, a weight in him. And he can't put it into words. Such is the depth of difficulty he's feeling. But there's another word that comes straight on the heels of this word. If weight captures the first 2 verses, then the word hope captures 3 and 4. See what David says? But you, O Lord, are a shield around me. B-U-T, but. It's a huge word in that psalm. Why? Because it defines a turning point. Some of the deepest problems we have when we suffer depression and difficulty is that we can't see an alternative. We can't see anything changing. Annually, we come with the painful and terrible statistics of suicide, many of them young people who basically have come to a point where they cannot see their situation changing. They can't see it getting any better than this. They can't see them getting over this. They can't see them fighting through this. They can't see overcoming the shame or the difficulty or the pain that they feel. And so they assume that the best way is just to put a full stop at the end of their life and finish it. When David says, but you, O Lord, he's saying, there is an alternative. There is something that can be life beyond Absalom, beyond the pain that I feel. It's a huge word in this psalm. It's David stopping long enough, just long enough to think, it doesn't have to finish here. There is something other than this. I have a hope beyond this moment. This is why this word hope captures so perfectly verses 3 and 4. It's David expressing himself. Look at the words that he uses. He talks about God being a shield around him. He talks about God being the one who lifts up his head. He talks about God being the one who answers him. What powerful words these are. Shield, lift, answers. They define the richness of the Christian's hope. When external forces are coming against us, when circumstances and situations compound together to drive us into the ground, we have a shield. We have a shield, which means that we will never experience as much pain as we could have done had we not had that shield. When a Roman soldier ran into battle with his garrison, having his shield and sword did not immunize him from potential harm. He knew that it was a good likelihood he was going to get a good smack on the head with something heavy, could well get a sword driven through his leg or his arm, but he knew that as long as he had a shield, he had a real fighting chance of making it out alive. Without that shield, it was game up. David says, God, you are my shield. You give me a fighting chance in the worst of moments. He talks about God being a lifter of his head, which goes beyond just externals, the forces that come against us. He's talking about something internal. To lift the head is a sense of lifting hope. We typify being depressed as those who have their head down. Those who feel difficult about themselves, low about themselves, are often reflected in their body language, which is often that they look to the floor. Have you noticed that? People can't look in your eye when they feel ashamed. They can't lift their head when they feel depressed. There's something very symbolic about the way we hold our heads, given our moods at the time or what we're going through in life. David says, Lord, you are the lifter of my head. Very important, because what David feels like is just hanging his head. He feels deeply afflicted. He feels betrayed by his family. He feels ashamed that his son has driven him from his kingdom. He feels a traitor, that he's let down the people who depended on him to stay as the king. All these emotions are flooding around in David's brain. And yet David says, Lord, in the midst of this chaos, you lift my head. And that closing word, you answer me from your holy hill, is David's way of saying, even in this chaos, I can discern the voice of God. God will answer. It will not be silent. He will not leave me to perish. He will answer. So he's defined his weight in verses 1 and 2. He captures something of his hope in verses 3 and 4. And then when you get to verses 5 and 6, it exudes with comfort. The great comfort David carries. What are his comforts? Listen to what he says. I lie down, I wake, I am not afraid. These are the key phrases you find as you read verses 5 and 6. I came across a statistic this week from Aviva.com. I think they're an insurance company, but they were obviously funding research into life insurance and health and one thing and another. And on this particular trait of thought, they were saying that 16 million adults in the UK suffer from sleepless nights. 67%, they went on to say, suffered from what they called disrupted sleep. 67%. That's almost like 2 out of every 3 people you meet on the street are going to be those who have never had a solid night's sleep where they've slept right through for some reason whatsoever. Now, it could be a medical problem for whatever reason that keeps them awake, but I would wager a guess that a lot of people are having sleepless nights because of growing anxiety, some kind of internal trouble, some kind of mental torment sometimes, or kind of problems or difficulties. This is very key for David, why he says it, because he's experiencing this. He is so mentally disturbed by everything that's happening, he can't get to sleep at night. And yet, when he turns to God, he says, Lord, not only do you lift my head, but as a result of that, as a result of knowing that God is my shield, that he lifts my head, that he will answer me, I can lie down, I can wake, I can get on with my everyday life. That's really what he's saying. Why? Not because David's saying, I'm emotionally superior to everybody else. After all, I am a king. I have this fantastic electric personality. I'm super confident. I'm fantastically positive. We've lost it if we think that's what David's trying to say. His reason is given right there in the psalm. Listen to what he says. I lie down and sleep. I wake again. Here it is. For the Lord sustains me. There's his secret. David knows that God, as a shield, as a lifter of his head, as an answerer, as someone who comforts him, as someone who protects him, David knows that God will sustain his life, even when it looks like there's no chance of that happening. This is the powerful message of this particular psalm. It started with David in absolute despair. How many are my enemies? This is a disaster, God. This is the worst thing that could have happened to me. We've all been there. We have all been there in those absolutely dark moments. But he goes from there to pondering about the hope that he carries, the comfort that he can rely on. And ultimately, when you get to the end of this psalm, which is very powerful indeed, he talks about his great confidence. And you'll see this as we go through the Psalms a number of times. Listen to the words of verse 7. Rise up, deliver, strike, break. These are all powerful words that he gives as he closes this psalm in verse 7, talking about his enemies ultimately being defeated by the power of God. David knows that however huge the problem is, he has got a bigger God. And I know that's such a cliche, isn't it, that people use. But it's not a cliche to David right here, right now. And you know, it seldom isn't a cliche for people who genuinely feel the Goliath size of their problems, to just stop and think, God is far bigger than this. When I was a kid in the playgrounds, we used to draw comfort from the fact that if we ever got into an altercation with somebody and they threatened to get us, we would use that old line, well, if you touch me, my brother will beat up you because my brother's bigger than you. And you know, you got to the stage where it came down to brothers and then dads. Well, my dad's bigger than your dad. And it seemed as if the winner of the contest was whoever can convince the other that what they had, be it a brother or a father, was far bigger, stronger and better than what the other person had. David is feeling this sense of confidence. My God is bigger than your God. The power I have with me is greater than the power that's coming against me. The shield, the comfort, the hope, the confidence I have is far greater than anything that can unsettle me or depress me. That's an incredible place to get to, and it's not a place you immediately jump to. You know, I often hear Christians say, well, if you feel down, just trust God, it'll all be better, as if this is an instantaneous thing. Like the moment I get down, all I have to do is open my Bible, read a half a verse, and I'll feel on top of the world again. Or just drop to my knees, pray for about 30 seconds, and I'll be totally fine. And because that's what people of faith do, isn't it? I don't think so. I think David, when he writes this psalm, he takes himself on a journey. He is still a believer. He still loves God. He's still a man after God's own heart. He's still deeply passionate. And yet, he begins the psalm feeling totally lost, completely broken. You can be a passionate man or woman of God and still experience deep chaos, deep depression, deep disillusion, deep pain. That's reality. That's the world. That's what we live in. But then as he goes through the psalm, it is reflection and thought and self-talk at times and faith and reminding himself that brings hope and then comfort and ultimately great confidence that God will put all these enemies aside and will bring blessing. And if you read the final verse, verse 8, what is David's confidence? Deliverance belongs to the Lord. I don't know, maybe people around David would have said, David, you're the king. You beat Goliath. You've led us in more victories than any other person we've known. You can take Absalom. In fact, some people were saying that. And even at the very end of the conflict, David's cry was, don't harm Absalom. Because he even had people around him saying, we're going to get rid of this guy for what he's done. David's confidence is not in his ability. It's not in how wise he is or how skillful he is or how strong he is. David's saying, my confidence is in God. Ultimately, he will work this out. Perhaps like me, you've been through some really dark times in your life. The temptation is to retaliate, isn't it? To figure out a clever response or to somehow get back at people who are trying to get back at you. But the wiser thing is to just trust God. is to say, God, you are my hope, you're my comfort, and you will be my deliverance. You'll be my confidence. It's not a cop-out. Some people think, oh, that's just a way of saying you can't be bothered doing anything about your situation. I don't think so. David, in this psalm, is doing something. He's not leaving it to chance. He's not shrugging his shoulders. He's not lifting his hands in the air in despair. He's doing something about it. He's bringing himself back to the source, back to God. And in doing that, he's finding great confidence at the end by believing that God will come through for him. So today, as you've listened to this, and maybe you can go and reread Psalm 3 and realize that whatever you are going through, however deep a despair you're in, God's your confidence. He's your hope. He's your comfort. And in doing that, we grow together. God bless you.